A Bible for the Romans. Virgil, the gentle poet, was writing the poem that was intended for the Roman Bible. Long before he left for Gaul, Augustine had conceived of the idea and convinced Virgil of the need for it. It was well known. He had pointed out that the Roman people had denigrated. The early Romans had been hard-working, law-abiding, and God-fearing. Now they had grown soft and immoral. Something was needed to bring them back to the sturdy virtues of their forefathers. Some great poem should be written, Augustus felt, that would inspire them with pride in their race, their history, and their old religion. The Greeks had such a book in the Iliad of Homer, which kept alive the memory of the old gods and heroes. The Jews had a sacred book which told of their God in the ancient days of their race. Why should not the Romans also have a sacred book or poem? It was to Horace that Augustus had first spoken about writing it. But Horace, content now and happy on the farm in the hills which Macedes had given him, was not to be tempted into such a long and arduous task. Virgil, more hard-working and conscientious, had been persuaded to undertake it, and so plans had begun for the famous Latin poem, the Aeneid. It was decided that the theme of the poem should be the old, well-known legend of the Aeneas. He would show how difficult a task it had been for Aeneas to find the Roman race, and how he had been able to do it only because he had been given instant obedience to the gods, by whom he had been guided. Almost for the moment, Virgil had consented to write the poem. Augustus had been impatient to read it. While away in Gaul, he kept writing so many letters to Virgil to inquire about his progress that the gentle poet was driven to mild desperation. "Upon my honor," he replied, "if I had anything worth your listening to, I would gladly send it. But the subject is so vast that I almost think I must have been beside myself to undertake it, especially as I am devoting part of my time to more important studies." From the first line to the last, the poem was to be for Virgil, a difficult undertaking, but he worked on industriously, and by the time Augustus returned to Rome, he had 6 books, or half of it, written. He had come up to Rome from Naples with a manuscript, expecting to read it to Augustus, only to learn that Macedes, that Augustus was ill and not expected to live. Now that Augustus was well again, Virgil was again preparing to read the poem to him when illness once more intervened. This time was young Marcellus, who was stricken, and this time death was not to be cheated. In the summer of 23 BC, Marcellus died, leaving 16-year-old Julia a widow. His mother, Octavian, was prostrated with grief. All Rome was shocked by his death. In mournful silence, the crowd listened to the funeral oration and watched the procession winding out past the theater named for the boy, which is still standing in Rome, to the Campus Martinus, where his body was to be cremated. Augustus was stunned by the loss and could scarcely believe that the ashes of young Marcellus and not his own were the first to be laid in the newly completed tomb. That tomb may also be seen still in Rome. After the funeral, Virgil, returning to his home on the Esquiline, felt that before reading it to Augustus, he must now add another verse to his Aeneid. The name of Marsilius, he thought, ought now to be included among those of future Roman heroes mentioned at the end of the 6th book. So a day or so later, the poet was sitting at his desk with the parchment unrolled before him, writing the words, "Thou art Marsilius." Then, searching for more words to fit the meter, he sat staring into the space, one long leg twisted about the other in the ungainly fashion of the country boy he had never quite ceased to be. Nearby in the gardens of Marcinus, he knew that Horace and other congenial friends were engaged in delightful idle conversation with their wealthy patron. But he was determined not to join them until he had mastered the verse upon which he was at work. Finally, it was perfected, and then, 7 years after Virgil had begun work on it, the day was set, and this part of the Aeneid was read for the first time. The sun shone down in the peristylium, touching Virgil's dark head and casting his shadow on the marble table before him as he modestly unrolled his manuscript. The circle of listeners waited expectantly. Juliet was there, and Octavia, heavy-eyed from weeping. Augustus nodded, and Virgil began to read. His voice trembled at first, for he was very shy, but soon the sweeping rhythm of his own words carried him along. And for a time being his hearers lost themselves and their own sorrow in listening to the hardships and sorrows of the ancient hero Aeneas and his Trojan followers. The Aeneid, as Virgil scarcely needed to explain, had been patterned after the Greek poem, the Odyssey, sung by Homer about 1,000 years before. As that told of the Greek hero Ulysses and his adventures after the siege of Troy, the Aeneid told of the Trojan heroes of Aeneas, from the time he escaped from the burning city of Troy until he founded a new home on the Tiber. This, in brief, is the song or story of the 6 books of the Aeneid, from which Virgil was now reading.